خانم ها آقایان، روز و شبتون خوش. به نشست 160 کانون کتاب تورنتو خوش آمدید. امروز همینطور که اطلاع داریم آقای دکتر شائول بخاش برای ما صحبت میکنند در مورد روزهای پایانی رضا شاه. پیش از اینکه آقای دکتر شروع کنن طبق معمول چند نکته رو من خدمتتون عرض میکنم و میپردازیم به گفتگو با آقای دکتر بخاش. اولا سخنرانی امروز به زبان انگلیسی خواهد بود. دوستان میتونن سوالاشون رو طبق معمول در قسمت چت این گفتگوی زوم بگذارند و به زبان فارسی هم سوالاتون رو میتونین بذارین اونجا. من سوالها رو خواهم پرسید و دکتر پاسخ خواهند داد. نشست بعدی ما در همین ساعت 2 بعد از ظهر به وقت تورنتو در روز یکشنبه، سومین یکشنبه ماه می خواهد بود. یکشنبه 17 ماه می. به همگی خوش آمد میگم. امیدوارم که با حضور شما و با حضور آقای دکتر بخاش نشست پرباری داشته باشیم. دوستان میتونید سوالاتون رو از همین الان در قسمت چت بگذارین. پس از صحبت‌های آقای بخاش شروع میکنیم و به سوالات خواهیم پرداخت. عرض کنم که ببخشید دکتر بخاش استاد بازنشسته دانشگاه جورج میسون هستند. زمینه پژوهش‌های ایشون در تاریخ خاورمیانه مدرن و به خصوص ایران متمرکز هست. دکتر بخاش سالها به عنوان روزنامه‌نگار در روزنامه‌های کیهان، تایمز لندن، تایمز مالی و اکونومیست کار کردند و سپس در مراکز دانشگاهی و پژوهشی از جمله در دانشگاه پرینستون به تدریس و پژوهش پرداختند. کتاب‌های ایشون از جمله عبارتند از ایران، سلطنت، بوروکراسی و اصلاح در دوران قاجار، سیاست نفتی و انقلاب در ایران، دوران آیت الله ها، ایران و انقلاب اسلامی و نهایتاً کتاب سقوط رضا شاه، استعفا و مرگ بنیانگذار ایران نوین که به تازگی منتشر شده به زبان انگلیسی و امروز در این نشست معرفی میشه. آقای دکتر بخاش خیلی خوش آمدید. از شما سپاسگزارم که دعوت ما رو پذیرفتید. خواهش میکنم بفرمایید.
خیلی ممنون. سلام بر همه. Reza Shah seized power in 1921 and for the next 20 years he dominated Iran, and with the assistance of very capable lieutenants he transformed and modernized it. His reign, his considerable accomplishments and his shortcomings have been amply covered in many books and articles, and those of you who joined the session on Reza Shah at the book club a few weeks ago heard a great deal about his reign. My book covers fresh ground. It focuses on the circumstances and events that led to the abrupt end to his reign in 1941, to his involuntary abdication and exile, to his life in exile, and to his always tense and prickly relations with Britain, under whose control he had fallen in the period of his exile. When World War II broke out, Reza Shah declared Iran's neutrality. He wanted to protect Iran from the ravages of the war. In addition, Iran had important trade relations with belligerents on both sides of the conflict, relations that were also important to Reza Shah's ambitious economic programs. Germany was deeply involved in Iran's industrialization. Britain was crucial to the operations of Iran's oil industry, one of the largest employers in the country and the main source of foreign exchange revenues. The Soviet Union provided the overland route across which much of the trade between Iran and Europe passed. Yet in August 1941, in violation of Iran's neutrality, Britain and the Soviet Union invaded Iran and occupied it. The stated reason was the risk posed to Allied war interests by the large German community in Iran. The British feared that these Germans would serve as a fifth column, would try to establish a pro-German government in Tehran, and would engage in sabotage of the railways, important communications, and oil installations. But there was a second, more important and weightier reason. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union in July 1941, made the overland route from the Persian Gulf to the Soviet Union across Iran crucial for the Allied war effort. But the use of this overland route was, of course, contrary to Iranian neutrality. Hence, the invasion and occupation. And then, believing Reza Shah would obstruct full cooperation with the Allies, the British next engineered his abdication. How did they do that? They did it in a number of ways. First, the British Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, authorized the BBC in its Persian language broadcasts to launch an intense and severely critical campaign against Reza Shah. Broadcasts that made clear to Reza Shah and his ministers that the British no longer wanted him on the throne. These broadcasts criticized Reza Shah for jailings and executions, for manipulating elections and suppression of the press, for amassing wealth at public expense, and much more. Secondly, directly and indirectly, the British ambassador in Tehran, Sir Reader Bullard, made clear to the Iranian prime minister and foreign minister that even the succession of Reza Shah's eldest son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, to the throne was at risk if Reza Shah did not immediately abdicate, turn over all his wealth to the state, leave Iran, and take all his other sons with him. The British even briefly flirted with the improbable idea of doing away with the Pahlavis altogether and restoring the Qajars, the dynasty that Reza Shah had overthrown, to the throne. Third, Eden knew with near certainty that, fearing the Russians would arrest him, Reza Shah would abdicate if the Allies entered Tehran, which they had refrained from doing so far. On September 16, 1941, the Russian and British forces entered and occupied Tehran, and as foreseen, Reza Shah signed the documents of abdication and prepared to leave Iran. Having abdicated, Reza Shah was under the impression that he was free to choose his own place of exile. And the women of his family had decided on Argentina, a country with which they had no familiarity, but which they thought suitable due to its climate and its distance from the theaters of war. The British, however, had no intention of allowing Reza Shah to settle in South Africa or in any neutral country where he might become the center of intrigue, the focus of Nazi propaganda, or the focus of unwelcome media attention. They wanted Reza Shah firmly in British hands somewhere in the British Empire. They had initially decided on India, but the Viceroy, Lord Linlithgow, refused to allow Reza Shah to even set foot in India, let alone to settle there. He noted, and I quote, he would simply be a gift for Jinnah and the Muslims who want to stir up trouble for us over Persia. After an urgent search for an alternative, the British settled on the island of Mauritius. It was conveniently isolated and remote, and the governor, Bede Clifford, was willing to host Reza Shah. Reza Shah, however, was not told he would be going to Mauritius rather than South Africa, not told, that is, until he was on board a British ship outside the port of Bombay. Feeling betrayed, he protested angrily and fired off angry telegrams to British officials. But the reality was that he was helpless and yielded to the inevitable. By now, the fierce and formidable ruler, whose ferocious anger could leave his ministers quaking with fear, had grown decidedly less imperious. His country had been invaded and occupied. His beloved army had collapsed. Under British pressure and to preserve the crown for his son, he had abdicated, and now he was leaving the country to which he had devoted so much of his life. Something in the man had broken. As he made his way across Iran and into exile, his daughters saw before them a stooped, suddenly aged man. He was no longer given to his ferocious fits of anger. For the first time in anyone's memory, he complained that he felt tired. For the first time, members of his family saw tears in his eyes. He grew dismissive of the trappings of royalty that had surrounded him. "Bring it down," he said, when he saw his picture in the office of the director of customs at Bandar Abbas. "There's no need for my picture anymore." He told a former minister who came to see him on official business, but feared incurring his pleasure, "Don't be afraid, I don't count for anything anymore." Listening on Radio Tehran to the attacks on his person by newly emboldened members of the Majlis or Parliament, he remarked bitterly, "I no sooner set foot outside Tehran than the same persons who always praised and were sycophantic about my actions and my work are now singing a different tune." By the time Reza Shah and the royal family boarded the British ship, the SS Bandra, the royal party was quite large. There was Reza Shah and his wife, her lady-in-waiting and her half-sister, 6 sons, 3 daughters, Reza Shah's son-in-law, Feridun Jam, his private secretary, a cook, and several servants. Before he had abdicated, and as the British insisted, before he turned over all his wealth to his son for the use for public welfare, Reza Shah had been a very wealthy man. He had amassed a great deal of land, by some calculations, 2,000 villages or parts of villages across Iran. Revenue from this land had financed hotels, textile mills, a sugar refinery, and charities as well. And there was in his bank account in riyals, at the 1941 exchange rate, the equivalent of 10 million pounds in his bank account. Now, he was going to exile with a party of 19 with no money of his own. I haven't a penny to my name, he said. Where am I to go with this hoard? His money problem in exile was eventually resolved by regular transfers from his son, the ruling Shah. In exile in Mauritius, Reza Shah was no longer a free man. The British determined the place and the conditions of his exile. They decided how much freedom to allow him and members of his family. They censored his mail. They decided if he could receive visitors from Iran, even from members of his own family. Members of his family who wished to leave Mauritius to travel to Iran or elsewhere needed British permission, and such permission was rarely granted. The Foreign Office issued guidelines to the governor of Mauritius that, although modified from time to time, governed the British handling of Reza Shah until his death in 1944. Clifford was told that there was no intention of treating Reza Shah as a prisoner, that every effort should be made to make his stay as comfortable as possible. However, the directive added, and I quote, "It is only proposed that a discreet surveillance should be exercised so that the ex-Shah should not feel slighted. However, in the event the ex-Shah or members of his household attempting to cause political or other trouble in the colony, you have full discretion to restrict their freedom of movement by any means." Once in Mauritius, Reza Shah was, of course, beyond the reach of German or enemy agents. But British officials, with no reason as it turned out, remained concerned that Reza Shah would cause them problems. For example, on the eve of his arrival, of Reza Shah's arrival in Mauritius, an official of the colonial office observed that there were on the island some 40 to 50,000 Muslims, among whom Reza Shah might seek to cause trouble and might receive help from the Vichy element among the Franco-Mauritians. In that event, the official added, it might be necessary for the governor to take firm action. All these concerns proved groundless. Reza Shah displayed no interest in engaging in intrigue with the Muslim community in Mauritius, or even in making contact with the Franco-Mauritians. He disapproved of members of his family even mixing with the Europeans. All he wanted was to be left alone. During his 7 months on the island, he agreed to leave the compound of his house only twice. He restricted himself to walking in its gardens. Now, Mauritius, with its public parks, its green spaces, its abundance of flowers, and its mild, very rainy climate, was hardly an unattractive place. And Governor Clifford went out of his way to make Reza Shah feel comfortable. He appointed a highly competent research physician, I.D. Tonking, to serve as Reza Shah's aide and to see to his needs. The house the governor's staff found for Reza Shah, Valerie, was a very fine 3-story residence with spacious gardens in one of the best neighborhoods of Port Louis, the island capital. Clifford's wife, Alice, furnished the house with French Empire furniture she found in the Port Louis Museum. The furniture had belonged to General Charles de Caen, Napoleon's general, when the French were in control of the island. And Alice Clifford was especially proud of a magnificent 4-poster bed, which she decorated with a crown. To her disappointment, Reza Shah refused the bed. He slept, as usual, on a rug on the floor. Reza Shah intensely disliked Mauritius. The wet, damp climate did not suit him. He felt he was a captive on an island surrounded by water. He yearned, he said, for the cool, bracing air of his mountainous homeland. He complained that he slept badly at night. Visibly despondent, he avoided contact with anyone outside his immediate family. When Governor Clifford, after Reza Shah had been settled, asked him at tea whether he was comfortable, whether everything was being done to meet his needs, Reza Shah replied, I quote, "What shall I say? We are prisoners. We are used to great open spaces in the mountains. To us, this existence is like a death in life." Once he abdicated and still on Iranian soil, Reza Shah also exchanged the military uniform he had always worn, even as Shah, for civilian clothes. Reza Shah hated wearing suits, but somehow he felt that no longer Shah, no longer commander-in-chief of an army, he did not deserve to be in military uniform. His son-in-law, Feridun Jam, pointed out that Napoleon had continued to wear his military uniform even in exile on the island of St. Helena, but it did no good. And as was his lifetime habit, Reza Shah established himself a routine to which he strictly adhered, down to the time of day. He had his first cigarette, his mid-morning tea, his afternoon tea, and his meals. As always, he rose early at 5 a.m. and had his breakfast alone. After breakfast, he walked for a good 2 hours. He walked again after lunch with the family, and he walked once again in the evening. Clifford and his staff, astonished at this penchant for walking, considered it vigorous exercise and inadvisable. To underline he was a prisoner, and despite pleading by his sons and daughters that he accompany them on an outing to a movie or somewhere else, he refused. I am a prisoner, he told his son-in-law, and I must behave like a prisoner. The only one of 2 times he agreed to leave his house, Valerie, was to attend a black tie formal dinner given by the governor to mark the signing of the tripartite treaty between Iran, Britain, and the Soviet Union to regularize the position of the Allies in Iran. Even then, he did not join the family for the entire evening. His son-in-law went to pick him up only after dinner was over. He found Reza Shah sitting on his bed, partially and uncomfortably dressed in the black tie suit that had been sewn for him by Indian tailors when outside the port of Bombay. He was holding his bow tie in his hands. May God grant me death, he said to his son-in-law. What should I do with this harness around my neck? From the moment he arrived in Mauritius, Reza Shah pressed to go elsewhere. He asked the governor, Clifford, and his aide, Tonking, to raise the matter with their governor. He asked his son, the ruling Shah in Tehran, to speak to the British ambassador, and the son did so on numerous occasions. But the British were not sympathetic. A move involved considerable cost, extensive arrangements, finding transportation for a large family in a time of war, and securing the agreement of officials in another part of the empire to accept Reza Shah. As one official at the Foreign Office commented, I quote, "We are under no obligation, moral or contractual, in this matter. I do not see that we have anything to gain from moving him." However, there were other considerations. Governor Clifford was concerned lest Reza Shah grow despondent and that his health suffer if he were kept on the island against his will. The Shah in Tehran was pressing his father's case, and the British needed the Shah's cooperation for the war effort. The tripartite treaty intended to place the presence of British and Soviet troops on Iranian soil on a firmer and more friendly footing was still under negotiation and yet to be signed, and the negotiations were proving difficult. Given these considerations, Eden, the foreign secretary, finally relented and agreed to allow Reza Shah to relocate to Canada as he wished once the tripartite treaty was signed, and it was signed in January 1942. Reza Shah was now ready or could now finally leave for Canada. The plan was for him to go by sea to Durban in South Africa, and from there to transfer to an ocean-going vessel for the voyage to Canada. Once in Durban, however, Reza Shah took a liking to South Africa, decided he did not want to risk the ocean voyage in a time of war, and that he did not wish to go to Canada at all. He preferred to stay in South Africa. The South African Prime Minister, Jan Smuts, agreed to allow him to remain, to settle in Johannesburg, and to be treated as a distinguished visitor. It was due to these unanticipated events that Reza Shah spent the last 2 years of his exile in South Africa. Reza Shah felt more content in Johannesburg than he had in Mauritius. The climate suited him well and was closer to that of the Iranian highlands that he loved. In Johannesburg, he ventured out of his home often, and he took his walks in the city streets itself. As always, he was attentive to everything he saw. At 65, and before his abdication, Reza Shah had left Iran only twice. Once as prime minister, he had paid a brief pilgrimage to the Shia holy sites in neighboring Iraq. And once as Shah, he visited Turkey as a guest of President Ataturk. He had not seen with his own eyes a modern European country, the kind of country he hoped Iran would become. Now he was impressed to see European-type cities in Africa. He was struck by the multi-story buildings, by the cleanliness of the streets, by the orderliness of people getting on and off trains. He was especially struck by the large presence of women in the public space, wearing, as he put it, men's clothes and driving taxis and even trucks. In Johannesburg, the isolation he had felt in Mauritius was also relieved by his ability to receive visitors from Iran. In June 1942, he received a confidant of the ruling Shah, Ernest Perron, with letters and a gramophone record. Remember those gramophone records? Of greetings from son to father. In April 1943, his second eldest daughter, Princess Ashraf, came to spend 6 months with her father. Reza Shah eagerly read the letters and newspapers she brought from Iran. He was always eager for news of Iran, and he bombarded her with questions about his son. And he continued the ritual he had begun in Mauritius of listening every evening to the Persian news broadcasts on the BBC, on Radio Berlin, and on Tehran radio when it could be accessed. Now, when Reza Shah decided to take up residence in South Africa, British officials feared that the South African color bar would prove problematic and lead to embarrassing moments. As W.H. Young at the Foreign Office observed, quote, "The ex-Shah's party are bound to have uncomfortable moments. Unfortunately, they are a rather dark-skinned family." And Tong King, the aide who had accompanied Reza Shah from Mauritius to South Africa, added, "The whole situation is further complicated in that they all look on themselves as being completely and wholly white." As it turned out, aside from some problems encountered when Reza Shah wanted to move to another larger house, these concerns were not borne out. No incidents involving members of the royal family and the color bar were reported by British officials in South Africa during this period. And in interviews conducted years later, members of the royal family could remember no color bar-based incidents during their South African stay. The older boys seem to have encountered no problems, according to Tonking, in enjoying what entertainments Johannesburg had to offer and engaging in what Tonking called, quote, their amorous adventures, unquote. Another source of concern was that Reza Shah's 5 sons were not getting a proper education. The Shah in Tehran was unhappy to hear that his brothers' only entertainment were cabarets and cinemas, and that they were neglecting their studies. The boys did have tutoring in Johannesburg, but it was spotty. The attempts to no avail to arrange for a proper education for the boys involved in time officials in Johannesburg and London and the royal court in Tehran, the British and Iranian ambassadors in Cairo, the director of the British Council in London. And these efforts are worth mentioning because it seems to me they provide us with a mirror to the loss of moorings, to the dislocations caused to the royal family by exile. The 3 older boys, aged 18, 19, and 20 when in Johannesburg, were already beyond school age. Reza Shah preferred to send them back to Tehran, but the British ambassador Bullard thought this a bad idea. He cabled to the Foreign Office that they would not complete their education, they would idle away their time and get into bad habits. And he reported that the Shah agreed with him. The 2 younger boys, aged 16 and 17, could not attend the local schools because they lacked the necessary language skills. Their level of education was already too low, and the color bar presented another problem. For over a year and even longer, different proposals were considered and for one reason or another discarded. To send a tutor from Switzerland to train the boys, to send the boys to England for their education, to send them to the famous British boarding school in Cairo, Victoria College. In the end, the 2 younger boys were sent back to Tehran, and the 3 older boys remained with Reza Shah in Johannesburg. Although members of the royal family were freer in Johannesburg than they had been in Mauritius, British oversight remained, and censorship of letters and restriction on travel remained in place as well. These restrictions were often applied. For example, in 1943, Foreign Secretary Eden directed that Reza Shah should not be allowed to receive any more visits from members of his family. By early 1944, Reza Shah himself had been growing more reclusive and despondent. His private secretary, Ali Izadi, noted that he avoided people, had grown attuned to being alone, and rarely ventured down from his room before noon. He always ate his meals in his room alone. The advent of Nowruz, which, as we know, the Iranians celebrate as a family, as a moment of rebirth, of hope, of new beginnings, was always the worst time of the year for Reza Shah. Marking Nowruz with the family in March 1944, Reza Shah seemed to his secretary Izadi more crestfallen than usual. To his daughter Shams in Tehran, he wrote, "My physical condition is not bad, but as to my state of mind, it is better not to speak." Repeatedly, he asked the British to be permitted to relocate to somewhere still in the British Empire, but nearer home where members of his family could more easily visit him. He told his sons in March 1944 that he hoped this would be the last year of his life. British officials were unmoved. If he were relocated nearer to Iran, they believed, this would suggest that the British were intending to return him to Iran, and this would have an unsettling political effect in Iran itself. And Bullard, the British ambassador, noted, quote, "As you know, we are anxious that he should remain as far away as possible from Persia." As a result, his aide Tonking was instructed to tell Reza Shah that he must remain in Johannesburg for the present, at least for the duration of the war. Tonking did so and reported to his superiors that Reza Shah, quote, "took it well, but said that as soon as the war in Europe was over, he was leaving, on foot if necessary." Tonking added, "I told him I would be happy to walk with him." By June 1944, Reza Shah's physical condition had visibly deteriorated, and he had grown much weaker. He complained that he felt unwell, but as usual, he refused medication or the attention of doctors. He was now taking his daily walk in his own bedroom, and his private secretary, Izadi, noticed one morning that he could barely manage even this brief pacing back and forth. He suffered a heart attack before dawn on the morning of June 25, but attended by a team of physicians, he seemed to recover. The arrival of his daughter, Princess Shams, boosted his spirits. On the evening of July 25, with Shams there, he chatted and he engaged in the banter he sometimes used with his staff. But the recovery proved brief. On the morning of July 26, Izadi was awakened by a loud knocking on his bedroom door. It was Reza Shah's personal servant, Mahmoud. "His Majesty won't wake up," Mahmoud said. Izadi dressed and hurried to Reza Shah's side. Reza Shah appeared to Izadi to be sleeping. He wrote, the look on his face was peaceful. There was no sign of death on it. His hand was still warm to Izadi's touch. "How is your Excellency's health?" he asked. His master did not respond. Reza Shah had passed away. His long, unhappy exile had ended. Thank you.
سپاسگزارم آقای دکتر. با اجازه شما به بخش سوالها بپردازیم. دوستان، این نشست همزمان در صفحه فیسبوک کانون کتاب تورنتو هم پخش میشه.
من نوشته های سوالا رو نمیبینم، باید خودتون تکرار کنید.
من خدمت شما میخونم. آقای کی پرسیدند که رضا شاه is the pioneer of the new Iran. do you think that he had some major mistakes, including taking position pro-Germany, also his agreement to leave Iran?
And also his agreement to leave Iran?
Yes.
Well, he certainly was the architect of modern Iran. I don't think anyone disputes that. He really wasn't, as many imagined, pro-German. And although by the late 1930s, Germany was Iran's major trade partner, deeply involved in Iran's industrialization, and most of the machinery Iran had was of German origin. But even Bullard, who didn't like Reza Shah very much, reported that if Reza Shah reported to the Foreign Office that if Reza Shah would make his views, was free to make his views known, his sympathies would lie with us. I think this idea that Reza Shah was pro-German or somehow pro-Nazi is not entirely correct. As to leaving Iran, I mean, I don't see how we can consider that a mistake. He really had no choice. As I described in my lecture, the British reached a point where they insisted on his abdication and departure. As I said, they launched this attack on him on the BBC. And they made clear to Iranian officials that they might not allow Mohammad Reza Shah, his son, to succeed to the throne if Reza Shah did not abdicate and immediately leave Iran.
سپاسگزارم. آقای دکتر، مسیر مسافرت رضا شاه توسط انگلیسی ها از ابتدا مشخص شده بود که قرار هست به جزیره موریتس ایشون بره. شما گفتید که در هند اجازه ندادن که اونجا ساکن بشن، ولی آیا قرار بود در هند ساکن بشن یا اینکه مسیر رو از قبل مشخص کرده بودن که باید ایشون به جزیره سنت موریس بره؟
نه اول خواستن در هند تبعیدش کنن. وقتی که وایسروی هند رضا شاه رو قبول نکرد، مجبور شدن یه جای دیگه پیدا کنن. و جالبه که به خیلی از مستعمرات تلگراف فرستادن که آیا رضا شاه رو قبول میکنن، که بالاخره افتاد به موریس.
بنابراین اون چند روزی که کشتی در کنار ساحل هند منتظر بود، در واقع اینا منتظر بودن که یه جایی برای ایشون پیدا کنن، درسته؟
و وایسروی هند نمیذاشت کسی، یعنی رضا شاه یا کسی از فامیل از کشتی پیاده بشه رو خاک هند پا بذاره.
بله. سپاسگزارم. پرسیدن که علیرغم همه خدمات رضا شاه، آیا او یکی از آرمان‌های انقلاب مشروطیت یعنی اجرای قانون را قربانی نکرد؟ اشاره می‌کنن به رساله یک کلمه مستشارالدوله.
بله، رضا شاه خب بالاخره دیکتاتور بود و مطبوعات آزاد نبودن، انتخابات رو کنترل میکردن، خودش خیلی از نماینده های مجلس رو خودش انتخاب میکرد. بالاخره مرد نظامی بود، کشوری به دست گرفت که دولت بی قدرت بود، یعنی فکر میکرد جز با یه دست آهنین این مملکت رو نمیشه اداره کرد.
بله، شرکت کننده پرسیدن آقای احمد محبد در مصاحبه با تاریخ شفاهی دانشگاه هاروارد میگوید پس از اینکه علی دشتی در مجلس اعلام کرد رضا شاه در راه خروج از کشور است و جواهرات سلطنتی را دارد همراه میبرد و خارج میکند، محمد رضا شاه آقای مهبد و علی قوام که اون زمان همسر اشرف پهلوی بوده، این دو نفر رو مأمور میکنه که برن و این جواهرات رو از رضا شاه بگیرن. اینها از تهران به اصفهان میرن و جواهرات رو از رضا شاه پس میگیرن و برمیگردونن. مهبد میگوید که به محمد رضا شاه گفته بودند اگر پدرت جواهرات را خارج کند کلکش جنابعالی کنده است. مهبد میگوید محمد رضا شاه به او و علی قوام گفته که هر جور شده این جواهرات را بگیرید و بیاورید، بدون آن زنده نخواهیم بود. شما در پژوهش‌های خودتون در این زمینه به چیزی برخوردین و نظرتون چیه؟
من در مطالعات خودم کوچکترین مدرکی چیزی ندیدم که صحت این داستان رو تایید کنه. اتفاقا جنگ که شروع شد جواهرات سلطنتی رو از بردن به بانک ملی، صندوق بانک ملی، همونجا موند و در حضور دقیقا یادم نیست ولی چند تا از وزرا و نماینده های مجلس اینا دقیقا حساب شدن و هیچی کم نبود. یعنی این داستان که رضا شاه جواهرات سلطنتی رو با خودش برده صحت نداره.
سپاسگزارم. آقای دکتر، شما اشاره کردین که نامه‌های رضا شاه و در واقع کارسپاندنسی که از اونجا به ایران و بالعکس میشد سانسور میشد توسط انگلیسی‌ها. با توجه به اینکه در ایران ارتشی که احتمالاً طرفدار رضا شاه بود از هم پاشیده بود و رضا شاه محبوبیت چندانی در ایران نداشت، این ترس انگلیسی ها از ارتباط رضا شاه با داخل ایران ناشی از چی بوده؟
اولا انگلیسان وقت در خانواده سلطنتی که رسیدن موریس نمیخواستن نارضایتی رضا شاه و فامیل در زندگی در موریس در ایران در دربار ایران منعکس بشه. دلیل اصلی اون بود. ولی بعداً که رضا شاه خواهش کرده اجازه بدن منتقل بشه به یه جای نزدیکتر به ایران، اونجا بله مثلا سفیر بولارد نگران بود که نزدیکی رضا شاه به ایران ممکنه اوضاع داخلی ایران رو به هم بزنه یا مسائلی به وجود بیاره، ولی توضیحاتی نداد. خیلی موضوع روشن نیست. ولی در سانسور نامه ها مسئله اصلی که نارضایتی یه فامیل در تبعید در تهران منعکس نشد.
دکتر عطابکی میپرسن که من از I enjoyed very much reading your book. What do you think about the Soviet cooperation with the British on Reza Shah's abdication?
You know, I had no access to the Soviet documents, so I really have to judge this by what I saw in the British archive. It seemed to me that Eden took very much the lead in pressing for Reza Shah's abdication. And as I mentioned in my book, he met frequently with the Soviet ambassador in London and secured his agreement to this policy. I would imagine the Soviets would just as soon have seen Reza Shah go themselves.
سپاسگزارم. پرسیدند رضا شاه مردی وطن پرست، دیکتاتور و قدرتمند بود. اگر روشنفکران ایران پتانسیل برخوردهای بهتری با رضا شاه را داشتند، آیا ممکن بود رضا شاه به همراه آنها مسیر بهتری را برای ایران رقم بزنند؟
جالب این هست که در ابتدای صعود رضا خان بعد رضا شاه، روشنفکر ایران خیلی طرفدار بودند و اتفاقا اروان ابراهامیان در کتابش راجع به این دوره قبلی نشان میدهد که خیلی از روشنفکران امید یعنی میل داشتند که یه مرد قدرتمندی مثل موسولینی بیاد ایران رو به دست بگیره و خب یادمون نره که خیلی از روشنفکران، فروغی، داور، افراد خیلی برجسته وزرای رضا شاه بودن و با رضا شاه هم همکاری کردند و خیلی از برنامه‌های رضا شاه از همین روشنفکران آمد. ولی خب بله، مسلماً بعداً با خفقان مطبوعات با دیکتاتوری خیلی از این روشنفکران زده شده.
سوال شده که علت اصلی اصرار انگلیسی‌ها بر استعفای رضا شاه چه بود؟ آیا اونها با توجه به اینکه کشور را اشغال کرده بودند و ایشون هم استعفا کرده بود و سلطنت به پسرش واگذار شده بود، اصرار انگلیسی‌ها بر خروج رضا شاه از ایران چه بود؟ آیا فکر می‌کردند که برنامه‌های اونها ممکنه تحت تاثیر حضور رضا شاه قرار بگیره؟ علت هراسشون از حضور رضا شاه در داخل کشور چی بود؟
بعد از شهریور 20 بله فکر می‌کردن که ممکنه رضا شاه تا اون اندازه‌ای که خودشون می‌خواستن دولت ایران با متفقین همکاری نکنه نمی‌کرد. ولی دلایل دیگه بود. سفیر انگلیس در ایران سریدبولات خیلی مؤثر بود. حتی قبل از شهریور 20 نوشته بود که رضا شاه محبوبیت دیگه در ایران نداره، نارضایتی خیلی زیاده و انگلیس‌ها فکر میکنن رضا شاه سر کار میمونه به خاطر پشتیبانی انگلیس‌ها و خیلی یعنی بولارد دائما پیشنهاد میکرد که یه جوری دولت انگلیس حتی قبل از شهریور 20 دوری از رضا شاه بگیره. خب این فکر که در فکر ایرانی ها انگلیس ها پشتیبان رضا شاه بودن یکی از دلایل دیگه بود که خواستن هر چی زودتر رضا شاه از ایران بره، یعنی نشون بدن که طرفدار رضا شاه نیست. ولی فکر کنم بیشتر چیز بود، یعنی بعد از تسخیر ایران همین که میدونید انگلیس‌ها خواستار کنترل بنادر، فرودگاه‌ها، راه‌ها یعنی جاده‌ها و تمام سیستم ارتباطی ایران رو خواستن به دست بگیرن. فکر میکردن رضا شاه به عنوان یک شاه خیلی مقتدر و ملی پرست همکاری نخواهد کرد.
پرسیدن به نظر شما در مورد کشتن، زندانی کردن و از دور خارج کردن تکنوکرات های میهن پرستی مثل داور، تیمورتاش و بقیه چیست و این حرکات و سختگیری ها چه پیامدهایی داشت؟
البته کتابم راجع به دوره بعد از سلطنت رضا شاه هست، ولی در مقدمه کتابم خب شرح میدم، نشون میدم که خب خیلی از افرادی که به رضا شاه خدمت زیاد کردن قربانی رضا شاه شدن، مثل تیمورتاش، مثل داور. خیلی رضا شاه در سالهای آخر سلطنتش مرد مشکوکی شده بود، مسلماً هیچ مخالفت رو تحمل نمی کرد و خب درسته افراد پرقدرت مثل شیخ خزعل رو شکست داد، ولی همونطور که عرض کردم خیلی از طرفداران، خیلی از افرادی که خدمت کردن اونها رو هم تلف کرده. بله خب یعنی همونطور که همه میدونن و عرض شده دیکتاتور بود.
آقای دکتر پرسیدن که علت اصلی ورود متفقین به ایران چی بود؟ آیا انگلیسی‌ها از این فرصت می‌خواستن استفاده کنن رضا شاه رو از سر کار بردارن، یا اینکه واقعا آنطور که گفته شده برای رساندن پشتیبانی به نیروهای شوروی و استفاده از خط آهن ایران رو اشغال کردن؟ علت اشغال ایران و این وادار کردن رضا شاه به استعفا چه بود؟
ببخشید، علت همین دومی بود، احتیاج به استفاده از ایران برای پشتیبانی از شوروی. و میدونید که در طول جنگ میلیون‌ها تن جنس از بنادر جنوب ایران، از راه ایران به شوروی رسونده شده بود. دلیل اصلی شکی نیست اون بود.
پرسیدن سرکوب جنبش جنگل و قیام کلونل پسیخان در کارنامه رضا شاه هست. اگر این جنبش ها و اگر سرکوب این جنبش ها و گسترش خفقان و سرکوب در ایران بود به نحوی که نهایتا او دست تنها ماند، در واقع پرسوال این هست که فکر نمی‌کنین دلیل این تنها ماندن رضا شاه در مقابل انگلیس ها همین سرکوب ها و گسترش خفقان بوده؟
یعنی منظور از سوال این است که دلیلی که
علت اینکه رضا شاه در نهایت در مقابل انگلیسی ها دست تنها ماند و نتوانست مقاومت کند، فکر نمی‌کنین سرکوب این جنبش ها مثل قیام کلونل پسیخان و گسترش خفقان در داخل کشور بوده؟
ببخشید بازم سوال خوب نفهمیدم.
سوال این هستش که فکر نمی‌کنین علت اینکه رضا شاه در مقابل انگلیسی ها دست تنها ماند این سرکوب ها و خفقان بوده؟ از جمله اشاره میکنن به سرکوب جنبش جنگل و قیام کانون پسیخان. پسیان ببخشید.
نه، یعنی دست تنها موند به خاطر سرکوبای جنگلی ها و خزعلینا مسلما فکر نمی کنم. مملکتی که رضا شاه به دست گرفت، دولت مرکزی کنترل روی مملکت نداشت. ایلات آزاد بودن، شیخ خزعل خودش سلطنت میکرد در خوزستان. امین هر دولت مرکزی اگه قدرت داشت مجبور بود جلوی این نهضت ها رو بگیره. ولی خفقان داخلی، یعنی خفقان سیاسی، مسئله دیگه بود و مسلماً نمیدونم اگه فرقی میکرد در در حمله و اشغال ایران از طرف متفقین، ولی مسلماً در سالهای آخر سلطنتش محبوبیتی که در سالهای اول داشته خیلی کمتر شده بود.
سپاسگزارم. دکتر عطابکی میپرسن آقای دکتر فکر نمی کنید باید نقش شرکت نفت ایران و انگلیس رو در کنار گذاشتن رضا شاه مؤثر دونست؟ سهم خواهی به حق رضا شاه شرکت نفت رو به چه حد به مخالفت با او کشانده بود؟
خب مسلماً انگلیس‌ها ناراضی بودن که رضا شاه قرارداد اولی رو نقض کرد و قرارداد جدیدی که بیشتر به نفع ایران بود. حالا میدونم از اون قرارداد دوم خیلی انتقاد میشه، بالاخره بیشتر به نفع ایران بود، یعنی ناراضی بودن. ولی بازم اون دلیل اصلی حمله و اشغال ایران نبوده و خود شرکت نفت نه در حمله و اشغال ایران شرکت نفت حمله ای نداشت، سهمی نداشت.
پرسیدن که خبر مرگ رضا شاه چگونه گزارش شد در روزنامه‌های ایرانی و بین المللی؟
خبر
مرگ رضا شاه
در روزنامه‌های خارجی همونجور که همه میدونیم خیلی کم بود. مرگش در جوهانسبورگ،
بله
والا من اونو دنبال نکردم، نمیدونم، یعنی خیلی فکر نمی کنم خیلی خبر مهمی بود اون زمان.
آقای دکتر، علت این که جنازه رضا شاه رو به مصر بردن و در اونجا به امانت گذاشتن، علتش مخالفت انگلیسی‌ها بود با برگردوندن جنازه به ایران یا تصمیم خانواده سلطنتی بود؟
نه، مخالفت انگلیس‌ها بود. نه اینکه نمیخواستن رضا شاه برگرده به خاک ایران، ولی در زمان جنگ ترتیب چنین کاری مشکل بود و محمد رضا شاه هم نمیخواست این کار به طور سادگی انجام بشه، میخواست با یه نوع سرمونی جسد رضا شاه رو برگرداندن و خب در زمان جنگ برای انگلیس‌ها ترتیب هواپیما، کشتی، نوع چیزا مشکل بود. اینه که خیلی سمپاتیک نبودن به ترتیباتی که محمد رضا شاه میخواست بده برای برگردوندن جسد. اینه که مون در قاهره تا چند سال بعد.
سپاسگزارم. دوستان اگر سوالی هست لطفاً در قسمت چت بگذارین که من از آقای دکتر بپرسم. آقای دکتر، در مورد ثروت رضا شاه اگر ممکنه، شما اشاره کردیم به کوتاه. رضا شاه موقعی که از ایران میرفت یک آدم ثروتمندی بود و توضیح دادین که دسترسی به امکانات مالی خودش نداشت و بعد از ایران براش فرستاده میشد. در مورد ثروت رضا شاه اگه میشه یک کمی توضیح بدین. شما در پژوهش‌های خودتون این ثروت رضا شاه رو موقعی که استعفا داد و از ایران رفت چگونه ارزیابی میکنید؟
ثروت رضا شاه بیشتر در زمین بود. همونطور که همه میدونیم اون زمان یکی از مهمترین انواع سرمایه گذاری زمین بود و رضا شاه زمین خیلی جمع کرده. این زمین ها رو خب اسماً میخرید، ولی خیلی از فروشنده ها مجبور میشدن بفروشن و همیشه به قیمت های مناسب نبود، یعنی به قیمت های واقعی. و زمین باید گفت خوشش می اومد. البته تو زمین هایی که داشتم خب کارهای خوب که انجام داده، یعنی از لحاظ سرمایه گذاری و کشت و از این نوکارها. پولی هم که داشت همون بود که عرض کردم، تو بانک ملی حسابی داشت، مقدار ریالش یادم نیست ولی مقدار پوندش در اون زمان میشد در روز 10 میلیون پوند که خیلی پول بود برای، یعنی قدرت خرید 10 میلیون پوند در 1941 نسبت به امروز خیلی زیاد بود.
شرکت کننده میگن که آقای دکتر عباس میلانی گفته که 40% نقدینگی ایران در حسابهای رضا شاه بوده. شما با این گفته موافقین که 40% پول نقد ایران در حساب رضا شاه بوده؟
بخشین چیه ایران در
40% پول نقد،
پول نقد ایران
بله، در
حساب
رضا شاه، یعنی حساب شخصی شاه.
والا من این رو تحقیق نکردم و خیلی بعید میبینم، یعنی 10 میلیون پوند دیگه نمیشه گفتن 40% تمام ثروت ایران بود.
آقای سعید میپرسن که میدونم که موضوع کتاب شما درباره مسئله حجاب نیست ولی میخواستم نظرتون رو بدونم درباره قانون منع حجاب. آیا موافقین که این قانون در راستای رهایی زنان بود؟
خب از کارهایی بود که اتفاقا در مورد سوال قبلی و روشنفکران، خب اون یکی از فکرهای روشنفکران بود حتی قبل از که رضا شاه سر کار بیاد و مانند همه کارهای رضا شاه و دولت اون زمان خب با یه مقدار با زور انجام شد، ولی به نظر روشنفکران و به نظرم خود رضا شاه معتقد شد برای آزاد کردن زنان کشف حجاب لازم بود و تنها راهی بود که زنها هم شرکت کنند در جامعه و شروع کنند به کار کردن و تحصیل کردن و اتسترا.
شما گفتین که رضا شاه به زمین علاقه پیدا کرده بود. این علاقه به زمین و سرمایه گذاری در زمین های حاصلخیز آیا در رقابت با خانواده های قاجار از جمله خانواده فرمانفرما و دیگرانی که به هر حال تحت نفوذ رضا شاه بودن، این در رقابت با اونها نبود به نظر شما؟
فکر نمی کنم، واقعا نمیدونم، فکر نمی کنم، ولی رضا شاه یادمون نره از یه ده در یه ده به دنیا اومد و مانند خیلی از دهاتی ها تشنه زمین بود و زمین نوع مهم ثروت بود در ایران در اون زمان. از مسلمان از خود همین خانواده ها مانند فرمانفرمایان ها زمین های اونها رو هم گرفته
بوده. طبیعتا. آقای دکتر اگه شما بخواید به طور خلاصه در چند جمله رضا شاه رو خلاصه کنین چه خواهید گفت در مورد ایشون؟
خب باید ما در نظر داشته باشیم ایران رو که رضا شاه به دست گرفت چه نوع ایرانی بود. ایرانی بود که دولت درآمدش اکتفا نمی‌کرد برای مخارج خود دولت و در 1921 هنوز دولت ایران از دولت انگلیس سوبسید می‌گرفت برای خرج روزانه دولت و برای بریگاد قزاق. دولتی بود که در جنگ بین‌المللی اول قدرت نداشت مانع ورود ارتش‌های عثمانی، انگلیس، روس به خاک ایران بشه. در طول جنگ بین المللی اول انگلیس‌ها 3 ارتش در ایران داشتن. دولتی بود که ارتش واقعی نداشت و کنترلی رو خیلی قسمت‌های مملکت نداشت. روی ایرات مسلماً دولت مرکزی قدرتی نداشت. به همین دلیل فکر میکنم که یعنی کارهایی که انجام داده در 20 سالی که سلطنت شاه بوده، خب کارهای خیلی بزرگی بود. مسلماً ضعف‌های رضا شاه رو هم میدونیم و اون این بوده که دیکتاتور شد و تحمل انتقاد، مخالفت را اصلا نداشت. یعنی آدمی بود به نظر من، یعنی در دموکراسی در دنیای فکری او اصلا وجود نداشت. فکر میکرد که باید با یه دست آهنین حکومت کرد و این کارو کرد.
سپاسگزارم از حضورتون آقای دکتر بخاش. خیلی ممنونم. دوستان از شما هم سپاسگزارم که به حضور پیدا کردین. نشست بعدی ما همونطور که خدمتتون گفتم یکشنبه 16 ماه می خواهد بود. در اینجا برنامه رو به پایان میبریم. با سپاس از آقای دکتر بخاش. آخرین کلام با شماست آقای بخاش، بفرمایید.
منم از دعوتی که کردی خیلی متشکرم و از همه شرکت کنندگان.
دوستان روز و شبشتون خوش. خدا نگهدار.